It feels like Nebraska fans are in a little bit of a disoriented state after what we saw last week against Minnesota. And I understand why. There is this huge disconnect between what we've seen from the first 6 games of the season to what we saw in the 7th game of the season. And now we don't know what that means, what to expect, what that looks like going forward. And so I wanted to walk through that a little bit before we get to Northwestern, because I do think we're going to find out a lot about this team against Northwestern. I also think, no disrespect to the Wildcats, who are having a much better year than I think any of us anticipated at 5-2, running the ball really well with Komalafe and playing pretty good defense as well, top 20 total defense in the country. I think, with all due respect to the opponent, this has way more to do with Nebraska than it does Northwestern. And I'm going to break down why here in just a second. First of all the things that went wrong against Minnesota were basically all of the things, right? That's the first place to start when trying to diagnose if this is a systemic issue, if this is a lasting issue, or if it was just a Minnesota issue. And I bring that up because Nebraska hasn't been bad in all of those areas for 7 games. They had 1 game where they were bad at pretty much everything. And so what that tells me was that probably has more to do with the 1 game than it does to do with the football team in general. Now, as we've seen, that can certainly, I'm looking at you, Penn State, like that can certainly snowball on you quite a bit, right? It can go from UCLA to Northwestern to fired coach to season's over in a hurry. I don't think none of that's really on the table for Nebraska, minus the Northwestern of it all. But the fact of the matter is, it can go from being just, as for Penn State, just a UCLA issue, or for Nebraska, just a Minnesota issue, to a snowball issue if you don't address it. So I want to make that clear right off the top. But through 7 games of the season, 6 of them have not looked like Minnesota. It's like that old Sesame Street game. One of these things is not like the other. We have proof of what Nebraska's been capable of in different areas. And now, against Minnesota, some of the things that we were frustrated about came to the forefront. I'm obviously talking about the elephant in the room, the sacks, right? The 9 sacks against Minnesota. It's a team that had 14 all year coming into that. They raised that number by, it felt like they almost doubled it in 1 game, right? So there is some of those things that maybe lean a little bit more systemic than they do just being a Minnesota issue. But when everything goes wrong, you have kind of an Indiana thing that we saw last year. Nebraska versus Indiana and Nebraska versus Ohio State were the exact same football team. They're the same team that beat Wisconsin 44-25 and the same team that lost to UCLA in that same stretch there. So lots of things can be true at once, and I think we have to parse through that in order to not lose our minds for the final 5 games of the season. And so I'll start there. Nebraska's offense was dreadful against Minnesota. Just straight up terrible. There's no way around it. 6 total points, less than 200 yards of total offense, 0 touchdowns. Like, that's a bad day at the office. I don't care who you are. But that also hasn't been who they've been throughout the season. Obviously, you've got 20 points against Cincinnati, an offensive effort I think a lot of people were frustrated by. But besides that, Nebraska's been a very good offensive team throughout the course of the season. And I know people are going to say, well, 2 of those games are Akron and Houston Christian. Number 1, everybody plays teams like that every year. That's college football. Number 2, if your offense is truly bad, you don't score points against bad teams either. That's how it works. We've seen Iowa play, right? That's a thing that happens. And listen, Iowa's been a better program than Nebraska. I'm not throwing shade, but that's a consistently bad offense that doesn't score points against bad teams either, right? So both of those things cannot be true at the same time. Nebraska's offense has been good for most of the year, and they were dreadful against Minnesota. So do I take the 6 games or do I take the 1 game? I'm personally going to take the 6 games, knowing things still have to improve from the 1 game in order to replicate what we saw for the first 6. That's the first thing there. The second thing, I'll get more specific about the offense, and that's the offensive line. I know people have been very frustrated with the offensive line, and I understand why. It's hard to see your quarterback get hit that many times. I get it. But I also know that Nebraska was top 10 in the country in time until pressure was allowed going into the Minnesota game at more than 4 seconds per pass play. I also know, because I charted it myself, that Dylan Raiola only had pressure in his face in under 3 seconds 3 times in 38 dropbacks. That's a pretty decent offensive line effort. And that's not to say that they don't still need to get better, because they do. And that's not to say that I'm not worried about the Rocco Spindler injury, because I am. I don't know what that looks like to play offensive line with a cast on your hand. That seems like a problem. I don't know. He's definitely tougher than I am, but your hands are pretty important in offensive line play. So that's a wait and see thing for Northwestern. But what I do know is that Maryland's pass rush was way better than Minnesota's. That is unequivocally true. And they did a very, very good job against Maryland. So how do I reconcile that against a better pass rush, against better pass rushers, against an overall better team in Maryland versus what I saw against Minnesota? Keep that in the back of your mind when we're talking about this as we move forward as well. Let's move on to the running game. Let's use Maryland once again. Emmett Johnson, almost a $180 on the ground against Maryland. Then he goes to a rush defense that had really struggled in Minnesota, and whether it's not enough carries, not enough touches, whatever you want to do, they were able to keep Emmett Johnson relatively in check. So you go, okay, this is a really bad run defense against a guy that's been playing really well. What do I do with that? He's still got over 700 yards on the season. He's still one of the top rushers in the Big Ten, but he looked like he did against Minnesota. And the running game in general, I don't want to put it on Emmett so much, but the running game in general looked like it did against Minnesota. So what do we do with that when we've got this body of work versus one really bad game? What I tend to do with that, and I'll get to the defense here in a second, what I tend to do with that is chalk it up to the team just didn't show up. That's a thing that happens. We hate it. We hate it, and I get it. But Nebraska just didn't show up, right? When everything goes wrong, especially things that had gone right for most of the season before that, I understand you can talk about the offensive droughts in the middle of the games against Michigan State and against Maryland. I get it. But in those games, they still put up over 30 points against Big Ten opponents that I believe are better than Minnesota. So that matters too. Even with the offensive droughts, they still put up more than 30 points against both of those teams. So I sit here and I go, okay, that looks real to me. I feel like I know that there's something real there. I also know that it's a real thing that sometimes teams just don't show up. And it feels like that's what happened with Nebraska against Minnesota. Now, the million-dollar question then is, of course, will they show up against Northwestern? I think yes. I think yes. We saw it when they came off of the Michigan loss. They had the bye week. They showed up against Michigan State. I think they show up again against Northwestern. I don't know that for sure. We'll see it on Saturday. What I do know is that if Nebraska does show up, this game will have very little to do with what Northwestern does. It will have very little to do with the fact that they're a good rushing offense, but a struggling scoring offense overall. Only, I think, 89th in the country in overall total offense. It's going to have very little to do with the fact that this is a top 20 total defense in the country that gave Oregon as hard of a time outside of Indiana as anybody has this year in terms of their defensive presence. If Nebraska shows up and plays the game they're capable of, that's not going to matter very much. It's not going to matter that Northwestern mostly runs quarters and is not quite as deceptive on the back end as Minnesota was, giving Dylan Raiola some trouble in what he was seeing in his coverage reads. That won't matter as much if Nebraska just shows up against Northwestern. That's where this program's at. And I foolishly thought that Nebraska was past that, right? That they were past that type of loss. And the truth of the matter is teams don't ever really get past that. It doesn't matter. Like, culture is not a solid set thing. It moves, it flows, and it changes from game to game, from week to week, from year to year, certainly. I was talking with DB on the morning show, and he was talking about how in 1996, they're coming off of 2 national championships and probably the best college football team of all time, and a lot of those guys are still there. And guess what? They didn't show up against Arizona State, and they didn't show up against Texas. He told me himself they saw 7-4 Texas coming into that Big 12 championship game and did not take them seriously. That's a thing. Even with the best teams that we think the culture set and we love the coaches and everything else is right, sometimes it happens. It happens this year in college football. Alabama looks like they might be the best team in college football again this year, and they got their heads handed to them against Florida State in week 1. Florida State's been very, very bad since then. And Alabama's been incredible. This is a thing that happens in college football. We aren't exempt from that in Nebraska. We just aren't. The best teams in the country aren't exempt from it. By the way, Miami just lost to unranked Louisville. That's also a thing that happened on the very same night that Nebraska lost to Minnesota. No one's exempt from it, especially in today's ever-changing rosters in college football where we have more turnover than ever. So I understand being frustrated. I understand being discouraged. But what has to happen now is Nebraska has to show up against Northwestern. Nebraska has to be ready emotionally to take inventory of themselves and say, this is what went wrong, this is why it went wrong, and this is how we can fix it. That's why I like during the press conferences this week when the coaches are incredibly transparent. When Coach Butler says, I got a little sheepish in the game plan after the long run, I like that he's identified what went wrong. I like when Dana says, I probably need to run the ball a little bit more. I probably need to call plays that allow Dylan to get the ball out a little bit faster. Because that's part of the reason you end up with 9 sacks when you've got a decent amount of time to throw, is the ball's not getting out fast enough, whether that's the routes being called, the plays being called, or the quarterback holding on to the ball too long. There is a group effort there that leads to 9 sacks. 9 sacks doesn't happen because of one guy. That's just the truth. So I sit here and I go, okay, can Nebraska show up and show the maturity to grow from what we saw last week? I believe yes. I believe that's what you're going to see against Northwestern, partially because of what we've heard from the coaches, and partially because of what we've seen the 6 previous games, even the loss to Michigan, that Nebraska's been this year. This is clearly the one thing that is not like the other in the Minnesota game. On Saturday, we get to see, does Nebraska go back to being who they've been all year, or does it snowball on them? I think they go back to being who they were, and I think they get a really good chance to do that against Northwestern.